Good. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to the organisers for their patience, because they've been asking me if I would do this for, it feels like a couple of months now, and it's been very hard to identify a date. So we picked a date in the busiest week in the year, but I thought I couldn't postpone yet again. So I am here with you. I'm very interested in doing this because I think it would be good if we had a better relationship and a better understanding of the respective roles of evaluators and auditors. So I will try and share you some views on what I think we do, and then perhaps you could evaluate it or give us some feedback and tell us what you do. We're an audit body. We're independent. Our job is to provide assurance to basically to the budgetary authorities and beyond them, to the press and the public and everyone who finances this enormous enterprise, that resources are properly used. So that means that we look at, oh sorry, you can move on to the next slide straight away. Yeah, it's no need to wait on that one. So that means we want to tell people that the money has been properly accounted for, that the financial statements say what has really happened, what the EU really owns, what the EU really owes, that money has been used in accordance with the law, and one aspect of the law is the specification that is in the budget. And we do audits of performance. I think it's only when we do performance audits that we're really looking at external evaluation. So I'm going to focus on performance audits from now on. When we do our performance audits, we, as every supreme audit institution that I can think of, do our audits focusing around what we call the 3 E's: economy, i.e. that resources have not been wasted, that people have not spent more on obtaining the resources than they needed to; efficiency, which I guess you're familiar with; and effectiveness, which is actually, I think, in some ways a hard to define issue. It could be whether the programs have achieved their objectives. It could be whether they're in the process of achieving their objectives. It could be whether there has been some beneficial impact. But those are the 3 things we look at. And I think a crucial thing to understand about what we do is that we do this in order to make recommendations to the Commission. We may see other people doing things that are fantastic or that are less than fantastic, but what we want to do at the end of the day is to make recommendations to the Commission. So that means looking at a fairly high level at whether the programme as a whole is useful, and you'll appreciate that things which work well locally may not necessarily be feeding into something which is useful at the EU level, and vice versa. In 2000, now we do a lot of work on energy. I think that's the first thing I should point out. We are looking at the sustainable use of natural resources. In the EU context, a lot of that means agriculture, but increasingly it means energy and climate change. In 2017, we produced a landscape review on EU action on energy and climate change, which reviewed all the different things that the EU was doing. And it identified some areas in which we hadn't done recent work. One of those was the inventories of greenhouse gas emissions. Another was the area of energy efficiency. And as a result of that landscape review, we programmed some more work, which includes the 2 audits that we're going to talk about today, energy efficiency audits. We've also recently published reports on support for carbon capture and on free allowances under the emissions trading scheme. So these 2 audits that I'm going to talk about fit within a sort of range, a portfolio of studies, all looking at what the EU is doing to meet the carbon emission targets. And there's another energy efficiency audit which is in the pipeline on energy efficiency in industry. If you could move to the next slide. I mean, I asked myself the question where we add most value in this process, and doing so, I think, is tough actually, and perhaps I should say at this stage, we are keen that there is an evaluation cycle that operates for all EU expenditure and operates properly. By which I mean we are keen that there is proper ex ante impact assessment, that there are good monitoring arrangements, that there is an interim evaluation which comes in time to take some corrective action if necessary, and that before you start the next round of spending, you know what's happened in the previous period. And this, I think, is at the moment not very impressive within the EU, because the EU spends money over a 7-year period, habitually spends money with some delays, builds in a timetable for evaluation at the beginning of the process, which means that, for example, if I took the Common Agricultural Policy, which is not your interest, but I'll use it as an example, the Common Agricultural Policy operates in 7-year periods. We're just about to see the an ex post evaluation of the period which ended 7 years ago. But all the decisions on what we will do for the next 7 years have already been taken. So, you know, this cycle doesn't work really in the way. Okay, I'm getting a message that people can't hear. Is that true?
I can hear.
Okay, some people can hear. Good. So the evaluation cycle doesn't work the way we'd like to, because we really, I think, would like to make a lot of use of the work of evaluators, and we do make use of the work of evaluators, but much less than we'd like. So where do we add value? I think, of course, whenever a policy is announced, people announce big and impressive aims for that policy. The reality may be less glamorous. I think one of the good things we can do is really just shed some light on what is really happening, what is really being achieved, and that's something I hope that we've done that we've done with these. In the area of performance, say audit comes with a set of standards, which is that you obtain for your work sufficient, relevant, and reliable evidence to back up your conclusions. We find that procedures such as cost-benefit analysis, such as benchmarking, the use of surveys help us do this. We have access to all the financial records, and we will make use of the financial records to the extent possible. I have a team here of about 100 people. I always insist that they look at the evaluation reports before they present me with a draft report. I'm going to be frank. I think they do this with a certain amount of skepticism, because auditors are very keen on independence, as you've heard, and they're always, I think, concerned that evaluators need to please the people who've commissioned the evaluation. So it's maybe something we can talk about. In terms of looking at the programs we look at, very often they have. I've lost my screen. Maybe you could turn on to the next screen. Yeah. So perhaps this is a case in point of people making pretty big claims for a program. If this is the energy labelling, energy labeling includes the design of goods, of consumer goods or production goods, basically consumer goods here, and their labeling. And the Commission claimed that it made an extremely big contribution to meeting the EU's energy efficiency targets. And one of the things we wanted to do was to say, well, how true is this, and to what extent is it doing so? Now, it's difficult for us to form an alternative view on the design of products, but we are able to do a certain amount of benchmarking, looking at what the energy efficiency of products is in other markets. I think from that we found that in general all markets around the world have similar energy characteristics. And we also looked at energy labels. We wanted to look to see whether consumers understood them and made use of them. Obviously, with this policy, there's no benchmark of an area of a nearby polity, which is nearby jurisdiction where they haven't had these factors applying. So doing the counterfactual, asking yourself what would have happened if we didn't have this apparatus is really difficult. Now, clearly there would have been improvements in the design of products, even without this this program existing. Anyway, if you could move on 2 slides, please, I think. And yes, that's right. So we asked these questions with the objective of making recommendations to the Commission. Does it manage the measures effectively? And this is a very, very difficult question, I think. Has EU action contributed to improving market surveillance activities? Because our analysis was that energy labels would only work if the rules were enforced. So you could go on another slide, I think. So in order to do this, we went to talk to market surveillance authorities. We went to Sweden, France, Poland, and we're based in Luxembourg. We spoke to the Luxembourg people too. We talked to people in the Commission, DG Energy, DG Grow, and the relevant agency. We carried out a desk review of 9 EU-funded projects to improve market surveillance, because those projects gave us the best insight into what was really happening in terms of market surveillance. We consulted stakeholders. We looked at the market surveillance reports that are provided each year to the Commission, but frankly they're not the most enlightening of documents. And we picked 3 product groups to use as case studies. So that was central heating, refrigeration, and electronic displays, so monitors and TV screens. If you turn on to the next slide now. What did we find? We found that there was a prioritization of the product groups where there was the highest potential to save energy. That the energy labels had been improved over time and were reasonably well used by consumers, and that there were numerous tools and projects to support market surveillance authorities. So there were some positive areas arising from this. There were also some areas where we thought there was room for improvement. One was the delay in the regulatory process. It takes a long time to put it took, I think, actually an astoundingly long time to put a new label on a product. This is partly because the Commission had adopted a package approach, so it would wait until a number of new standards were ready before putting them forward for approval. And I think actually one of the reasons for that is that the bad press that the Commission gets every time it tries to take a much loved product like the old-fashioned incandescent bulb off the market. But that obviously delayed improvements for individual projects. We looked at the Ecodesign impact accounting, this study which tries to look what the impact of the policy had been, and we found it wasn't really reliable, so it was overstating the impact of this policy. And we thought that non-compliance was still an issue, even though quite a lot of resources were put into market surveillance. I think you could skip over 2 slides now, and we'd move to buildings. Sorry, could you go back 1? Yeah. Okay. Now, the energy efficiency of buildings is important to all sorts of carbon emission targets. One of the yardsticks we had here was how cost effective this support was, and obviously there is a dilemma here, I think. Now you could move on to the next slide. If you could move to the next slide. Thank you. And I think even one more, we go to the energy consumption by sector. You see how much energy is used in buildings. Everyone acknowledges that there's great capacity to cut energy use in buildings. In many places, it's just cost effective for you as an individual to do so. And if you offer a lot of support for those projects, you've got a dead weight problem. You're funding things that would have happened otherwise. In some cases, the payback period may be tremendously long, and we've seen that in the past in public buildings. We've previously looked at public buildings, and we've identified cases where the payback period for the investment would be more than 200 years. So that's more than the expected lifetime of the building. So we wanted to see to what extent that tool, which we're very familiar, was used to target money. You can move on another slide. Yeah, this shows how much money is going into it. 4.6 billion of the EU budget and 2 billion of national co-financing. So that's a reasonable amount of money if it arrived in your bank account. In terms of the EU budget, this is over a 7-year period, so that's not a very important part of the EU budget, and it's a tiny part of the total amount that will be spent on improving the energy efficiency of buildings. So there's no real way of disentangling what the EU is financing from what is happening overall in this area. We'd previously found that energy efficiency wasn't really guiding the way money was used. On the next slide, you'll see some quotes from relevant reports, but I think I'll leave that with you and let you examine that at your leisure. And we could go on to the next slide, so here we have our observations. There was here's a classic criteria. Were they targeting the right buildings? There was no basis for saying that they were. There was no classification in most countries. I think there were a couple of member states which did do this, but in general there was no classification. If you could stay on that previous slide. There was no classification of the ones where there's biggest risk of wasting energy. That there were some barriers which are not financial barriers, such as the sort of governance structures for multi-occupancy buildings. And sometimes people were putting money into the sector without solving those structural problems. And there are far too many grants with 100% public aid rate, which is not a good way of using money, because it's better if you commit the people who are receiving the funds to making a contribution of their own. But there were some good practices too, and Lithuania, I think, was a good case study on this, in that it did tackle some of the barriers. And we also saw something that we see fairly frequently, which is that EU funds simply replaced existing national schemes, and that from the EU point of view is not a good use of funds. If you move on. Okay, again, typically lots of first come, first served distributions of funds, which doesn't provide any incentives for picking the better projects. You just pick the first which come. That is associated with all sorts of poor practice, and no ceilings on the cost per energy saving, no maximum, neither a minimum nor a maximum payback period. And a very, I think it's on the next slide, but I'll maybe anticipate. Yeah, no, it's not on the next one. Nor was there really an analysis of the relationship between these grant-supported schemes, so the EU frequently uses grant-supported schemes, and other measures like the energy efficiency obligations schemes, which are universal throughout the member states. So very poor analysis of the interrelationship with other schemes. If you could move on one more. I'm afraid we find this all the time. The indicators were not really measuring the things that you would want to measure if you really wanted to know what was happening. And then we can turn on maybe to the recommendations. So we recommended improving planning and targeting of the investments. There's obviously a case for aligning the programs with the national energy and climate plans. We think then you need, if you're going to have grants schemes of this kind, and I think it's an open question of whether you should, or at least whether you should from an EU level, then you need some common rules on project selection, and you definitely need a monitoring process that gives you some insight into what you're doing. So that in summary is what we found. If I refer back to my earlier comments, if the evaluation cycle were better embedded into the processes of the EU, we think we would see better programs. We think we'd be able to draw more meaningful conclusions on what is being achieved and what is not being achieved. I think in this case it would raise a question about whether the program is an appropriate program to carry on at EU level. But there wasn't enough information out there to answer that question definitively one way or the other. So I hope that provides some insight into what we do, and I'm ready for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, great, and thank you, Peter, for this insightful, indeed, presentation. We have some time now for questions before I invite Sarah and Charles into the panel for a more in-depth panel debate. So I would again invite all the participants to put their questions in the Q&A. So please don't put your questions in the chat window, as they will go unnoticed. I'm focusing on the Q&A window now. Two questions have already been answered by Jean-Sébastien Brock, our colleague. First one has been upvoted, so I'll take that one. Has the Commission an obligation to answer the recommendations from the court?
The Commission needs to tell us whether it accepts the recommendations or not. And we will follow up 3 years later, normally, to see whether it has done so. In fact, when we make a recommendation, we also issue a timescale for it, and it's sometimes the case that the timescale is more than 3 years. But we follow it up, but they're not mandatory. They are recommendations. They are not instructions. So, in fact, I think over the years, I think I see the Commission. I'm not sure there's a terribly good relationship between whether the Commission accepts a recommendation and whether it does it or not. I think some of the recommendations it doesn't accept, it does do, and some of the recommendations it accepts and finally never happen.
It doesn't do. Okay, so there's no logic in it. Okay.
Well, I'd like to think there's an association, but it's not very strong, not very strongly correlated.
Okay, interesting. Next question by Jean-Sébastien. Are the auditors of the court also exchanging with the European Parliament Research Service, the EPRS, when auditing a policy? Because indeed they are also making their own assessments.
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, if they've done, I mean, there is contact in both directions. We in the olden days, until March this year, I think it was actually one of the first things cancelled by the lockdown was our annual sit-down meeting with people from the EPRS, because we've, over the last, I don't know, decade or so, had an annual meeting where we discuss what's in our work program. I find them very useful reports, and I will always look at them, and actually, I very much have the impression that they find our reports useful as well, because they're frequently quoting them. I mean, we have different roles, but I think we can definitely make use of each other's work.
Okay, thanks a lot. I see another question from Vlasios. Did you remark the lack of cost effectiveness criterion in the subsidy programs or in all types of policies?
No, it's an interesting question. We were focusing on the subsidy programs, but I think cost effectiveness criteria are in general weak, or where they're not weak, at the very least they're not explicit. So it's very hard to see what's happening.
Sorry, Peter, are you?
Sorry, did you not hear me? Yeah, I think we were in that report. We were focusing on within the program, but I think in general the cost effectiveness information is underused.
Okay, so the answer is in general. Okay, next question then. We still have a few minutes. How do you measure long-term impacts of the energy label for buildings, especially regarding deep retrofit? Thanks, Victor.
I think I would ask you guys that question. I mean, clearly there are cases where deep retrofits don't work, but I think it's not. It's a little bit too micro for me.
Okay, so maybe we keep this question for the panel. I'm sure that either Sarah or Charles will be able to answer. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question.
What about measuring energy efficiency in the long terms of the EU 2030 target? Is that the next question?
Yeah, that's the next one.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, something else we did was to look at the greenhouse gas emissions accounting, which some people behind me in Eurostat are very involved in, for example. And clearly there are, I mean, what you can really measure, I think, is the extent to which we're burning fossil fuels, and to the extent to which we're using electricity. And you can use these measures to measure what's happening in houses and what's happening in transport. But of course, for these programs, we're using sort of derived measures, and the reliability of that starts becoming questionable, I think. And certainly what we've seen is that the Commission with its consultants has been making quite big adjustments to its assessments of which programs are delivering in terms of reducing carbon emissions, or we're not reducing, even actually controlling them. Nothing has been quite as successful as COVID, I guess, but
okay, thanks, that's clear. Jean-Sébastien, again, what would be your recommendation to improve the reliability of the data from evaluations?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess we face a common problem in that monitoring data is frequently not very good. And if monitoring data were better, then the work of evaluators and the work of auditors would be better. If it were better, both in the sense of of itself being reliable, but also measuring the relevant things. So getting monitoring better would be, I think, near the top of the list. Then the other thing that I think the EU needs to think about is how its budgetary cycle and the evaluation cycle fit together, because the budgetary cycle is I'm not sure how well known this is in the outside world, but the budgetary cycle is essentially a 7-year cycle in which, you know, the big priorities are put together. This goes together with changing the rules for the schemes, and then the evaluation cycle gets tagged onto that. But the spending always lags a couple of years. I think if I were to step back from all the individual pieces of work we did and looked at what would make evaluation better, I think it would be doing evaluations on a 3-year period of spending, and accepting that sometimes you will have a different set of legislation in place for that period, but always doing your evaluation on, let's say, the last 3 years results or the last 4 years results, rather than this slightly artificial 7-year spending cycle.
Okay. Maybe just a side question on the first part of your answer, having the monitoring improved. What would be needed to have a proper monitoring system in place?
Okay. When we're looking at these energy measures, you need to know the kilowatt hours, and you need basically. Firstly, you need your starting point. You need to know how things were at the beginning of the program, and you need to identify ways that you will measure the impact that you're expecting to achieve. What tends to happen is, because for the first 2 years of a program, let's say, you're still spending money from a previous program, you won't measure what you're doing against in the new period. You'll be measuring, you'll be seeing what you did with the old money.
Okay.
So you need really to drill down and to get something that you can measure and which will be applicable from one period to the next.
Okay. Okay, thank you for this clarification. Question by Kevin O'Rourke has been upvoted, so highly relevant. In relation to the Ecodesign and Energy Labelling directives and regulations, to what extent did the outcome of your analysis led to a reduction in the Commission's claims or predictions regarding the impacts of these instruments?
Well, I don't know, but I observed that the Commission did reduce its estimations of the impact of these policies in parallel, and I think it actually done that before we completed the audit. That's not the first time I noticed this.
Okay, even before you completed the audit.
Yeah, no, because they clearly they know 2 years before we're going to finish a program what we're going to be looking at. Okay. If I took I mean, I said we recently did this thing on free allowance and under the emission trading scheme. The Commission announced changes to the rules on that 3 days before we published. So maybe there's other ways that we can measure our impacts than those we do use at the moment.
Okay. All right. I would suggest that we take another 1 or 2 questions and then go to the panel discussion. But the next one by Jean-Sébastien is more like a statement, not a real question. The next webinar will very likely be about emerging new measurement and verification practices that are used, for example, for performance schemes. So fully in line with these discussions. Indeed, thanks for this addition, Jean-Sébastien.
Yeah, that's. I mean, let's say one of our frequent recommendations is that you should not pay. I mean, we do a lot in the EU to measure inputs used and to reward people for putting inputs into something. So we co-finance programs. We measure how much co-financing we've put in. we don't measure what comes out of it. And if you've got smart measures of what you're trying to get out of it, then I think you can have much better programs. Okay. But that means putting a lot of things together. Mm-hmm. There was an attempt to move in that direction for the Common Agricultural Policy, and well, I wait with interest to see how successful that is.
Okay. Yeah. Well, indeed, nice to have this jump to another sector as well. And thanks, Jean-Sébastien, for pointing out indeed that one of the next webinars will on measurement and verification. Let's take then the last question by Klaus Sept. How would you distinguish between program policy evaluation and the audits you are performing? What is the methodological difference? Is there a chance by using compound indicators to relate the impact expectations to modeling and forecasting approaches? These are a few questions tangled together.
Well, okay, let's say I think there is a relationship, and I think we have, I think there's an overlap between what we're trying to do and what the evaluators are trying to do. I think what is different about it is that we are not that we are reporting basically to the people who've provided the resources rather than the people who've used the resources. Evaluators, I think, typically are reporting back to the people who've used the resources. So I think our audience is a little bit different, but there's an overlap clearly in their interest. And then we come. I'll try and phrase this properly. We are auditors. Auditors, are bound by a set of international standards, which provide requirements on the reliability of the evidence that you use to draw your conclusions. And I feel that there is a divergence there between what we feel we're allowed to do, what you might feel you're allowed to do. But that said, I would always encourage my my teams to use the full range of techniques possible and to put those together and to draw to draw all the conclusions that they can from it. And one of the reasons I accepted this invitation was, I am keen that that the performance auditors and evaluators are in touch with each other and are able to learn from each other. So I'm hoping to learn from all of you as a result of this. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks to you, and indeed it is a perfect bridge to opening the panel, because you already raised your views on evaluation and audit and how they complement each other. So maybe please allow me to introduce you to the panelists, Sarah Rieseberg and Charles Michaelis, both evaluators. So Sarah Rieseberg, she's a project manager at the Secretariat of German International Climate Initiative. From 2011 to 2020, she worked as an evaluator with Arepo Consult, focusing on project and program evaluations in the energy sector. And she's one of the co-authors of the Theory of No Change, a barrier analysis tool for energy efficiency interventions. Welcome, Sarah. And your colleague, Charles Michaelis, has 30 years of experience in designing and delivering evaluations of government policies and programs in the energy, environment, and low carbon fields. His clients include government departments in the UK and Australia, and he has also undertaken projects in Vietnam, Indonesia, China. So this is an impressive coverage of the globe. He's also chair of the board of the Energy Evaluation Charity, and he works as an independent consultant. Charles, welcome to you also. Immediately to you, Sarah. Peter already commented on this evaluation and audit complementary. What are your views on that one?
I think that's a highly interesting question, because there's this strong focus on cost efficiency on the side of the auditors, and I have I'm kind of wondering whether we are actually, because as evaluators, we're also looking at cost efficiency, and I, to some extent, wonder whether we are looking at the same cost efficiency. I mean, we're also using benchmarks and such tools, but I also wonder, and maybe that's a question, like going back to Peter, like if you saw, I don't know, in this case of energy efficiency in buildings, if you saw there was investment in switching from, let's say, coal to natural gas, this would appear very, very cost efficient, for example, in power plants, or even in like upgrading fossil fuel heating systems in housing. But as an evaluator, I would probably say this is not cost efficient, because in about 10 years' time, we would need to replace them, and they're not cost efficient in the long run, even though they're cost efficient in the short run. And I was kind of wondering whether your cost efficiency is the same that we are using, or whether it is the same or whether it's different.
Yeah, and I think we'd have the same response, actually. So we, if in fact, I mean, it's one of the things that we're continually, we haven't actually done this audit, so perhaps I shouldn't talk about it, but the idea of looking at the PIEs, the projects of European interest, so the network, the energy networks program, we are continually questioning whether these really ought to include natural gas pipelines or not, precisely for the reason that you give. But yes, over the next few years, that will result in that will look pretty good, but over a 10-year period it won't, and the objective should not be to build another set of dependency on fossil fuels. It should be to move beyond that. So yes, I mean, I think we're actually quite interested in taking a long-term objective. I mean, one of the I think my people are lucky in the sense that there are lots of international targets which are fairly long-term ones. So there is a 2050 target, there is a 2030 target, and we ask ourselves whether what is being done is in line with those long-term targets, not just whether it is whether it is good for this year.
Okay, so there's surely an alignment on this long-term thinking. Charles, you'd like to add something to that, or more on a general theme on complementary between evaluations and audits?
Yeah, I think I'd like to. Thanks, Didier. I'd like to go to this sort of. I sort of, as Peter was talking, I was thinking about, how as an evaluator, I would what is different about what I do, and I think there were three things that really struck me. I think the first is right at the beginning. Peter you talked about 3 E's: economy, effectiveness, and efficiency, and evaluators often use the OECD criteria to sort of scope evaluation, which has effectiveness and efficiency within it, but also has not economy. We'd often put economy under efficiency.
Okay.
But we also think about relevance. Is the activity doing the right thing? Coherence, how does it fit with other things that are going on? Impact, which I guess you would include under effectiveness, and sustainability, which I think is sort of bound in with this concept of transformation that people talk about a lot, but often I think you would have some skepticism about, as would I. I think our scope may be a little wider, and I think allied to that is your, as I think you said, you're sort of reluctant to attempt some sort of questions because you don't feel the evidence base could be good enough. And I think we're probably more ambitious at kind of having a go, even though we recognise that what we learn might be partial, but we still feel some learning is better than no learning. And I wondered whether, for example, I mean, I think theory-based methods have kind of developed to sort of fill that gap. But I mean, it wasn't something you mentioned, and I wondered if it was something that you as auditors would use, or indeed.
Sorry, I missed a little bit there.
Yeah, I think it's sort of theory-based methods for evaluation, things like contribution analysis and process tracing and things like that, which are kind of, I guess, designed to try and answer some, or sort of fill some of the holes that you rightly identified in the sort of more traditional counterfactual methods for evaluation. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting difference. I think we maybe have more tools in our toolbox, but I would certainly accept the criticism that those tools don't necessarily have all the, don't necessarily give you the same confidence in causality that the traditional benchmarking tool, the traditional counterfactual tools might use. So that was interesting.
If I can come back on that.
Yeah.
Relevance, yes, I think we is something that we include it under effectiveness, but it's definitely there. And in fact, I could give and also coherence is something that we look at fairly frequently. I'm aware of, I probably should not give examples, but I'm aware of examples where one scheme appears to push in one direction and another scheme appears to push in the other direction.
Yeah, you'll see it.
So you are paying with one fund to create a problem that another fund another budget line will then try to mitigate. And this is quite an endemic issue, I think, actually, and something that we do draw attention to. Possibly not as much as we ought to, but coherence is definitely something there. And whether something is relevant is something that we look at too. Actually, the guy who ran this audit on energy efficiency buildings, the project he led before that was on support for young farmers, and both those issues were present in what we did there. There is an EU objective to try and have more young farmers, which is to find someone under the age of 40, which does look young to me now. But this objective is, let's say, has always been there, and it's always been 40, and yet society as a whole is aging. There is a demographic. One of the reasons that you don't have so many young farmers as you might want to is that their dads live to the age of 80, and at no stage have an incentive to give up the farm. So that reduces the number of young farmers, and then of course you're subsidizing people to be farmers until the age of 80. And if you really wanted a coherent policy, you would probably say, you will, the amount of subsidy you get will take some account, let's say, of whether you receive a retirement pension or not. So yeah, these are things we look at, but it's true that when performance auditors get together, they are not the first things that are put on the table. And I think it is one of the areas where we could make more use of some of the methods that you do. Theory-based approaches very, very seldom used in performance audit, and yeah, I'd be keen to see what you're doing there and to see to what extent we could apply it.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe that's also jump into to another issue, because you've been talking about tools indeed, and in your presentation we also see that the data that you are relying on are not always of high quality. But how would you say what are the minimum information requirements for meaningful outcome for an audit? If you could start, Peter. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure how I would. I mean, let's say if we would expect the Commission to have meaningful information. If it hasn't, so if it's operating in the dark, then I think that would be one of our conclusions. And I think actually we probably it would be helpful if we were more explicit about what we were criticising at times when we say that there is not enough monitoring data available. I think we could. I think we could spell that out better for people. Okay. I am very dubious when a team comes back and tells me that they've got a large part of their evidence through interviews. Interviews clearly play a role in the audit process, but I'm looking for something which is more tangible than that, more analytic than that. So I'm looking for measures in these areas. I would be looking for measures of energy consumption in the different sectors. I mean, transport is something we've looked at, and for transport, energy consumption in transport can be more accurately measured because it's data that's used for fiscal reasons, for other reasons, and I think the challenge and the opportunity for the future that we're seeing is more use of big data, mm-hmm. And in some of the specific areas that my people look at, more information from satellite data.
Okay.
When we looked at greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and greenhouse gas emissions, the methodology there is based on declarations, but these days you can find an awful lot from satellite data, and to the extent we can find other sources, new ways of getting that information, I'm always delighted when we can use something like that. I think that's the way to move.
Well, I'm happy you raise big data, because indeed big data is on the digital agenda of the Commission as well. Sarah, is big data also something evaluators are looking into or increasingly look into?
I mean, maybe Charles will have a different opinion on that, but I think in most cases, because we are so specifically looking at projects or individual policies, something like satellite data, I would say, comes up very, very seldom. And I would be really thrilled to work with something like that, but I would honestly say there was never an opportunity to work with something that big. I'm happy if somebody has a functioning database that I can use, and really, that's about it. And like at times you will, I don't know, you will look at general data in certain countries where you doubt official data. You will work your way around estimating from, I don't know, the railway use or railways systems transporting coal. You will conclude emissions from coal power plants, but that's probably the maximum I've been able to work with in terms of big data. But Charles, maybe you did you ever have a chance to work with something really big, really exciting that actually demanded?
I have, Sarah. I've actually used satellite data.
Wow, I'm
forests,
jealous.
Which is fantastic. Although I think, I mean, certainly, I've used big data on a few occasions, quite a lot on transport, because as Peter says, there's good data there, both on sort of spending, but also on patterns of behavior. Things like the Google data that's available now on how people travel is really valuable. But I think my observation on data is that it's very, very rarely perfect. It's never perfect.
Yeah.
And the key for me is drawing sort of multiple sources, triangulating between them, establishing a credible understanding of what you think is going on. Yeah, I absolutely agree with Peter that I think evaluations rely far too much on interviews and not enough on either contemporary data from when the project was happening, rather than interviews that often happen sometime later, or things like big data, which can help to fill those gaps. So there's I think we as a profession can and should be more creative in how we find and use data.
Okay, so that's certainly an evolution.
If I could.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to reassure Sarah a little bit. I mean, bearing in mind that in my area here, we're not just looking at energy. I've got guys looking at farming and guys looking at fisheries, and those are areas. You know, farming is a classic area for using satellite data. You can forestries we also look at. So those are classic areas for that. But
again, Sarah, you need to get into farming.
Okay, I switched my job today. I can also see the use in energy. If I was looking at the expansion of coal mining or something like that, it can be useful. I totally believe that. But I'm just saying that it doesn't come up in these very specific evaluations that we are normally hired to do.
Okay, this is very inspiring. So it's always a pity to interrupt you, but I'm keeping an eye on the time as well, and we're already running a bit late. Okay, we started 10 minutes late, so I hope that's no big problem for all of you. Maybe as a last question, and just to close this one, if you, all three of you, if you were to make one single recommendation to policymakers to do more with evaluation results, and how can we close the loop between evaluation / audits and the process of policy making? So without entering too much into detail, what would your single recommendation be? And if I can start with you, Charles.
Okay, where I see it working well is when evaluation is absolutely embedded in the process from the start. So when from Peter described the program cycle, the policy cycle, but if you have evaluators there in the beginning, designing the evaluation, making sure the right data is collected, making sure early learnings are fed back, course corrected, both into the policy and into the evaluation, then I think it works well. But you do lose independence from that. So. Yeah, there's a trade-off, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Peter, you were already commenting on that, so maybe you can take the second.
No, I mean, I was very much agreed, and actually the independence point hadn't particularly occurred to me, so that was an interesting insight, Charles. But it would be my point. I think, you know, doing good impact assessments and designing your monitoring framework from the beginning and understanding how you're going to evaluate it, I think would be fantastic. I guess the other thing that I'm aware though is that every time the European Union enters in a 7-year planning cycle, something else happens. You know, so 14 years ago it was the financial crisis. 7 years ago it was the migration crisis. This time it's COVID. You know, so things come up, and your well-designed framework may turn out to be not quite as applicable as you first hoped. But
I suspect we all agree that 7 years is way too long.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, and then Sarah, before you run away to your new job at the farm, what would your final take?
That was forestry.
Sorry.
No, I would actually agree that obviously, as I call them, embedded evaluations are very fruitful, but you can gain independence if you have midterms. So if you're going halfway through a program, you still have the opportunity to actually prevent the worst, I would say. But there is an obvious problem that how do you feed in learning into new programs being developed that are basically not looking back at what was developed already before them, because a lot of things are not necessarily incremental learning. And there I haven't found the proper way, except for teaching of the learning of the individual staff that is busy in the new conceptualization of new programs. But there's a clear problem. How do we get this learning over into the next policy cycle where they don't look back and they have different political agendas present and different stakeholder groups? So they are not actually reading the past evaluations, and the past evaluations dealing with the past, and this is something entirely new, it seems. So I think there is a bit of a lack of evaluators giving feedback to new programs and policies based on their past experiences. And sometimes you're invited to actually give that, but it's not really included in any, it's not formalized.
Okay.
If I could butt in with a plug for energy evaluation, there is a wealth of information on past evaluations on our website, from past papers at conferences and things like that, which should be mandatory for all policymakers to read.
Okay, indeed. Thanks for making this reference, and indeed the link to the website has already been put in the chat window by Jean-Sébastien. So I see it's 50 minutes past 4. I'm going to close this webinar, which has been very, very insightful, at least to me, and I guess the same to most attendees. I would like to thank all of you, all the attendees, to keep with us 50 minutes longer than was anticipated. Thanks to Peter Welsh, our main speaker of today, for this insightful presentation, and also thanks to Sarah and Charles to join the panel for this nice debate on giving some insights on evaluation versus audits. So thanks a lot, everybody. We are hereby adjourned, and please watch your mailbox, because the slides and the recordings will be soon in your mailbox. So thanks a lot, and maybe see you at the next event.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.